Sergeant Pedro Hernandez, a municipal police officer on the gritty outskirts of Mexico City and a longtime Santa Muertista, believes he was both saved and healed by Saint Death. In May 2014, he was returning home after a late shift, and as he pulled into the driveway, he noticed a suspicious looking car parked in the street a few houses down. Looking closer, he saw four hooded men in the vehicle glaring at him. Aware he and his family were in mortal danger, he clutched the Santa Muerte medallion on his chest and quickly implored her to cover his family and him with her protective cloak. A hail of bullets hit his car before he could make a run for his house, and instinctually putting his police training into action, he covered his face with his arms and ducked. A lull in the discharge of automatic weapons sent Commander Hernandez bolting toward his front door, where his shocked wife let him in with two of the four sicarios in hot pursuit. His wife tried to slam the door on them, but the two assassins barreled their way in, ready to finish off the job. Bleeding profusely, Hernandez fell to the floor of his living room, thinking he was about to receive the coup de grace. Instead, one of the gunmen yelled, "Let's get out of here," and both ran out of the house. At that point, Commander Hernandez lost consciousness, only to wake up hours later to discover that his wife and two young children were unharmed, and that of a total 60 rounds fired at him, the 10 that hit him were all lodged in his arms. This was a quote from Devoted to Death, Santa Muerte, the Skeleton Saint, by Dr. Andrew Chestnut. Every culture has its ghosts, its legends, its mysteries.
From UFOs to haunted houses, psychic visions to cryptids, we explore the stories that defy explanation and what they reveal about what it means to be human.
I'm Chris Daly.
And I'm Ryan Geckner. We're anthropologists asking big questions about belief, experience, and the unknown.
This is Beyond the Human.
All right, everybody, we are finally back with a full episode of Beyond the Human. Like we said in our last headlines episode, we have been fighting plagues back and forth between our houses, so we appreciate you tuning in and bearing with us. We've got some episodes that we've been working on, but have been too nasally and congested to record. So we figured you didn't want to hear all of that, so we decided to bump some episodes back a little bit. So let's get into what we're talking about today. So this may come as something of a bit of a surprise to our listeners. Maybe, maybe not. Today we're going to be talking about one of the most popular Catholic folk saints in recent memory. But first, before we get to that, why are we talking about religion? And why are we sort of crossing into that territory? Well, I guess, first of all, a lot of things that are paranormal fall into that category, right? So, I mean, if we're going to talk about in a couple of episodes about exorcism, that one very squarely falls in a religious experience. But I think we kind of talked about this before the episode when we were planning this. You know, we like to kind of separate out religious phenomena from quote unquote paranormal experiences.
Or supernatural, I think.
I think this is a really good place for us to kind of make that distinction
Yes.
between paranormal and supernatural. And we kind of talked about this way back in our first episode, so all of our longtime listeners will know. But the difference between paranormal and supernatural oftentimes doesn't really matter so much in
common conversation. It really doesn't.
Yeah. But sometimes it does, and this is one of the cases where it does. And so in this case, we're talking about things that are beyond the natural world and beyond what we would define as, natural.
And I would argue that all of religion actually fits into this category, even though it makes people very uncomfortable sometimes to refer to it that way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so religion, really, we can look at religion as a way to understand and create frameworks for understanding supernatural phenomena or paranormal phenomena too, right?
Or just anything unexplained.
Yeah,
that's one of the things religion does for us. It helps us to explain the things that we can't explain.
Right. And so even though we like to partition off religion and say it is this thing that is separate, and I think for a lot of people, there's a lot of prickliness around religion, and rightly so for a lot of people. A lot of people have had bad experiences with various religions. But I think, in the paranormal community in particular, it's kind of tricky. I think there's in certain corners of the paranormal, there is, kind of I don't know if I want to say Christian supremacy, but I'm going to, because that's kind of what it is, right? For example, when we talk about exorcism, everyone pretty standardly goes to a Christian and almost often a
I
Catholic
would say really everyone goes to
perspective.
a Catholic
Right.
perspective. And I will talk about that, by
Yeah,
the way.
yeah, and we will, yeah, and we will talk about that because we kind of can't talk about exorcism without it. But that we wanted to kind of open this episode with that in mind, just because we know that for some people, religion is like a big turnoff, and people don't want to even think about it or deal with it. But I think if we want to think about paranormal and supernatural phenomena from a cross-cultural perspective, we really can't ignore it because so much of the way that human communities understand these things is filtered through a religious lens.
I also think it's important to say that this episode is focusing on La Santa Muerte. We're not saying that La Santa Muerte is supernatural or paranormal and
Right.
other religion isn't.
Right,
We're saying it
exactly.
all is.
Yeah, exactly.
And we
Yeah.
just happen to be focusing on that. And I think that's an important distinction to
Yeah,
make.
yeah, it definitely is. Yeah, because as we get into this, we're gonna talk about some perceptions around La Santa Muerte and kind of about the misconceptions around Santa Muerte devotion and things like that, that I think it's really important for us to point out that, like, we're not singling out this and other things like it as saying, oh, this is supernatural, but if you are just an everyday run-of-the-mill Catholic, then you're not. And I think that's really important for us to do. Before we dive into who Santa Muerte is, I think it's worth pointing out that as if you dig into any of this literature at all or anything about the community, Santa Muerte goes by many names.
And I love this. I think it's great because
Yeah,
there's so many different
so
meanings.
many names. So there is Santa Muerte, which just translates to Holy Death. There is Santísima Muerte, which translates to Most Holy Death. But there's also La Flaca or Flaquita, the skinny lady, La Huesuda, the bony lady, and La Hermana or Niña Blanca, the white sister or girl, among many others. Now, a lot of those names come from some of the influences that we think gave rise to Santa Muerte devotion. But you'll hear all of those used kind of interchangeably, and I'll probably flip between them as we go. So keep them in mind. If I say a weird, funny Spanish name, that's probably
I'm going to
kind
avoid
of.
the Spanish largely because I do not speak Spanish and I don't want to butcher the language
I don't speak
horrifically.
Spanish, but I took 5 years of Spanish in college, so I should be using it for something. So we're going to use it today, kids. So now that we've kind of said what we're going to talk about, why Santa Muerte, I think, is a really important thing to point out too. First and foremost, I think the coolest thing about it is that it has been called and likely is one of the fastest growing new religious movements in the world. And that a new religious movement is an important sort of distinction in religious studies. I'm not going to belabor the point with you today, but Dr. Chestnut, whose excerpt we had at the beginning, he talks about, how there could be upwards of 12 to 14 million devotees of the Santa Muerte, overwhelmingly in the United States, Mexico, and Central America. So this is a sizable group of folks that are practicing a form of folk Catholicism that the church has openly said is no good. And we'll talk about that a little bit in a second, too. One of the things, too, to talk about of those 14 million folks is within that, I think it's good for us to kind of talk a little bit about who those folks are. First, one of the things that we see that's kind of a new trend is that there is devotion among non-Hispanics, mostly young Euro Americans, which is interesting because as we talk about this is a very Mexican, Central American phenomenon, and then for it to be sort of being picked up by non-Hispanic folks is somewhat unexpected. I think if you look around, it's kind of being picked up in these new age circles and like these sort of eclectic pagan communities.
And I have a lot of interest in how those communities are interacting with La Santa Muerte in a different way
Yeah, yeah, definitely.
than kind of the more traditional Mexican
Yeah,
version
yeah.
of the religion.
But apart from those folks, it's interesting and important to note that now we see, from Dr. Chestnut's book that The majority of devotees are taxi drivers, sex workers, street vendors, housewives, and criminals drawn from Mexico's vast urban working class.
But one of the other groups that there's a fair amount of devotion among is kind of the opposite side. It's politicians
Yeah.
and police officers
Yeah.
and other people in law enforcement,
Yeah.
high-ranking officials. And that to me is really interesting because you hear so much about the devotion of criminals and the criminal element
Yes. Yeah.
surrounding Santa Muerte. And the other side of the law as well has a significant number of people who really are devoted to her.
Yeah. Almost gives a cross section of Mexican society today, which is interesting as a religious phenomena as well. So, where did Santa Muerte come from, Chris?
Where did it come from? Well, there's actually a couple of different places. So, when you look at religions, some of them are what's called syncretic, and this is a syncretic religion, and that basically means that it takes pieces of other religions and blends them together. So it's not simply I do this one thing and it's Catholic, and I do this one thing and it's, indigenous of some kind. It's a blending.
Hmm.
And that I think is really important because if you look at La Santa Muerte, there is definitely syncretism going on. And it's specifically combining Roman Catholicism and indigenous beliefs. And in this case, it's Aztec beliefs. To my knowledge, there may be some other indigenous beliefs in there.
Hmm.
But that's to my knowledge.
Yeah, and one thing that I think is really key to highlight here is that academics will wring their hands a lot about, and Dr. Chestnut talks about this in his book a little bit, that academics will wring their hands a lot about like where Santa Muerte devotion comes from, and really many devotees don't care about her origins. And I really love that about the all of the tradition around Santa Muerte because it's not about where she came from, it's about what she does and the fact that she has these miraculous powers that people associate with healing and a whole bunch of other things. And so even though we care it from sort of an academic perspective and a historical perspective, it's really about the lived experiences of devotees that people care about. And I think that's really something that's unique about her. I mean, you can look at Catholic saints, whether they be folk saints or legitimate canonized Roman Catholic saints.
And actually, we should talk a bit about that difference.
Yeah, we should. We should.
So, a standard canonized saint, this is somebody who is recognized by the Vatican.
Hmm.
And so they have to go through a whole process to become a saint. And certain miracles have to be attributed to prayers to that saint
Hmm.
or to the person who's hopefully going to become a saint. So it's a very formalized process, as most of Catholicism is.
Yeah.
And so when we talk about folk saints, these are people who have not gone through that process, but people who, in some part of the world, and it usually is pretty localized,
Hmm.
they are seen as a saint.
Hmm.
So they are prayed to, they are asked to perform miracles, but they have not gone through that process. Now, there are cases where someone was a folk saint and then goes through the process of becoming canonized. But there is a distinct difference between the people who have been recognized by the church and those who haven't. So, we've talked in the past, I believe, about relics
Hmm.
and
Yep.
and things like that. That's all canonized saints. It's people who have gone through that process. But you'll see a lot of similarities in the way folk saints are treated,
Yeah.
just not without being recognized.
Hmm.
But in this case, I don't see La Santa Muerte becoming a
No,
canonized
that would
saint.
be a complete about face from the church.
Because the church has really, and in some cases, the church almost looks the other way with some of the folk saints.
Yeah, Santa Muerte doesn't
Not in this
usually
case.
get that pass. Yeah,
Right.
yeah.
And so that's an important distinction that she is a folk saint and she is not someone who is like on her way to
Hmm.
canonization. The
Probably.
Catholic Church, from the Vatican has very much said, that she is not good.
Hmm.
Let's just use that.
Not acceptable
Not
as far
acceptable.
as the official Roman Catholic Church is concerned.
Right. So if you want to look at kind of her origins and where she comes from, There is some evidence for devotion to Santa Muerte and other skeleton saints in colonial Mexico going all the way back to the late 18th century. So this is not brand new,
Hmm.
just very quickly growing now.
Yeah.
There's been scholarly attention towards this and towards trying to understand it really from the 1940s.
Hmm.
But the whole phenomenon of her as this very important folk saint was pretty much underground for
Yeah.
a long time. It,
Yeah.
it, it wasn't something that people readily admitted to. It's still, in some cases, something that not a lot of people are willing to talk about,
Yeah.
which is
Yeah.
interesting
It's
to
changing.
me.
It is
It is,
changing, but
yeah,
yeah. Yeah, it's definitely it wasn't always something that people were super forthcoming about
yeah.
their devotion.
But even talking to some folks today,
Hmm.
there's still this reticence
Hmm.
at points to
Yep.
say, yes, I'm a devotee.
Yep.
It was in 2001 when Enriqueta Romero, or Doña Queta, created the first public Santa Muerte shrine in Mexico City. So we have evidence going back 1940s, even back to the late 18th century, but it was 2001 when there was a public shrine
Hmm.
right in Mexico City, which is,
Hmm.
of course, a hugely populated
Yeah.
city. So going back to the syncretic roots of Santa Muerte, I mentioned that there's this Catholic influence and the indigenous influence. So do you want to talk a little bit about the indigenous
I would love to
influence?
because I know you don't want to pronounce those Aztec words.
I don't.
So, first of all, there's some debate here. I want to kind of get that out in the open that there is some debate. But if you want to point to indigenous traditions in Central America in terms of deities that look kind of like Santa Muerte, there are definitely a couple
Mhm.
places we can look. So first and foremost, we have Mictecacihuat, is the Aztec queen of Mictlan, which is the underworld, and her husband Mictlan Tecutli. There is some question about whether or not this identification of a link has more to do with contemporary indigenous identity movements. So folks who are, Santa Muerte devotees wanting to point to their indigenous ancestry and using this as kind of a way to do that. But it's really kind of unclear. Now, regardless of that, Mexican culture, especially in how it's influenced by indigenous beliefs, has a really kind of unique relationship to death. I think a lot of folks, we talked about in our death episode that in the United States and broadly in the Euro-American sphere, we don't deal with death very well. We don't like to talk about it. We don't like to think about it, and things like that. And Mexico is kind of a totally different context. Many people probably know about Dia de los Muertos, and that's one prime example, which is another Mexican cultural standby that has somewhat debated indigenous roots as well. There's a deep tradition of a clear and strong relationship with death and not an avoidant relationship. People are open about death in Mexico. And there's even a book by an anthropologist, Claudio Lomnitz, called Death and the Idea of Mexico. So if you're really interested in that idea, that's a great book to check out. Now, that's kind of where the indigenous roots of this kind of end. If we want to look at the Catholic side, we're looking at Spanish Catholicism. And we have to actually go back to the Black Plague to get to the roots of some of this. So during the Black Plague, the depiction of a Spanish Grim Reapress called La Parca becomes really popular. And if you look at depictions of La Parca and you look up the medieval depictions, they look very similar to what you would see when you look at a picture of the Santa Muerte today. For many folks, or for academics who really care about this, the symbolism between Santa Muerte and La Parca really ties her more closely to that European influence rather than an indigenous influence.
What's really interesting is so much goes back to the plague and
Hmm.
kind of the timing of the plague, imagery that's used across many religions, but certainly Catholicism goes back to that time period. There was just a huge influence on every aspect of life,
Yeah.
when you look at that particular pandemic.
Hmm.
And it'll be interesting because I hear us saying it now. We all talk about COVID times.
Yeah, we do. Yeah.
We reference pre-COVID, post-COVID, and now this is obviously a much shorter time period than the Black Death was going
Right.
on.
Yes.
But it's interesting how a pandemic can really impact religion and art and a lot of different
Mhm.
things. I will say that the worship I don't know if worship is the
Devotion.
right devotion, I think is better. The devotion to La Santa Muerte has increased since COVID.
Yeah, yeah, there's a little bit in that. We're going to talk a lot about Andrew Chestnut's book in here because his book is kind of the book on the subject for sure. And also, we're going to be interviewing him actually later. So if you've been following along on Field Notes from the Beyond, you already know this. If you don't, please go follow us on Substack. But we're going to be interviewing Dr. Chestnut after this episode, and we're going to hopefully dive deep into some of our questions about this. And if you have questions, please shoot them at us on Instagram or wherever you get all of our content. But yeah, so I think COVID really did influence the way that people structure their devotion to Santa Muerte. I mean, there were candles that were like protection from COVID candles that had Santa Muerte on them, which is just wild. And so we'll talk a little bit more about that here in a bit. And one thing, like you mentioned before, too, is like this idea of keeping relics. And there is some sense that maybe there's a relationship here with the idea of Santa Muerte and death. But like we said, contemporary Catholic acceptance of her and her devotion is skeptical at best and outright repressive. I'm just going to say it at worst. There are statements from Catholic officials associating her with Satan because of her association with death. It's not entirely different from the way that the church views many folk saints throughout Central America and other parts of the Catholic world as sort of superstitious and kind of antithetical to church teachings and idolatrous, which to me, I grew up Protestant, so a Catholic calling anything idolatrous is just like, come on, guys, really? You guys are all about the image, and there's nothing wrong with that, but like, come on, y'all.
But what's really interesting to me, you know, there is definitely this sense from the Vatican and others that, folk saints in the Americas
Yeah,
are
that is
kind of
interesting.
looked down on. There
Yes,
are a ton of folk saints in Europe
in Europe, yeah,
and Eastern Europe. I
yeah,
mean, there's a lot of them, and you don't hear the same things
yeah.
about those folk saints
Yeah,
from the church.
I wonder if it's beyond Central America and it's more part of the colonized world because I know that there's a
Mm,
lot of folk saints in the Philippines too. And
true,
they've got
true.
strong Catholic influence there too. So I wonder if it's a holdover from colonialism probably. And I think it's worth noting that the former Pope Francis, a cardinal, and three U.S. bishops once declared the new religious movement as, and I quote, satanic. So there's clearly no love lost between the
I
church
don't think I've heard that as
and
recently,
Marte. Yeah,
as much recently, but it's still there.
well, and I think one thing that's kind of interesting to remember about Pope Francis was he was from South America.
Yes.
And so for him to come out so strongly, I mean, he probably had to because of that relationship, but I think that's interesting. If we want to look at her visibility today, like you were saying before, like Chris mentioned, Doña Queta's shrine really exploded devotion to Santa Muerte, especially from a sort of public facing, sort of out in the open perspective. Now you can find statuettes and candles, other devotional paraphernalia at all kinds of botanicas, metaphysical stores. I remember when we lived in Kansas, you could find them at Walmart throughout the US and Central America. So devotion to Santa Muerte has exploded, and you can find her ritual goods all over the place. What's interesting to me is that her popularity in Mexico rivals that of the Virgin of Guadalupe, who's the patron saint of Mexico. And when you think about Mexican Catholicism, that's likely who you're thinking of.
And that is the vision that people
Yeah.
have when they think of Mexican
Yeah.
Catholicism. They see sort of that image the of the Virgin of Guadalupe.
Yeah. Some rank La Santa Muerte as second only to God, supplanting Saint Michael and filling somewhat similar roles to Saint Michael, which I find
I
interesting.
actually think it's not just similar roles to Saint Michael. I think it's similar roles to Mary as well.
Yeah, yeah,
The
yeah,
Holy
definitely.
Mother, the
Yeah.
Virgin.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, we can't ignore the gender dynamic here because there is
yeah.
some interesting interplay there between Mary and Santa Muerte.
But I do think, her sort of supplanting Saint Michael and the Virgin. I mean, this has a lot of really interesting implications, particularly for women in Catholicism
Mhm.
and sort of where women's devotion goes. There are a lot of women in the Catholic Church who feel a need for a stronger female presence.
Mhm.
As
Mhm.
most people know, we're not going to go into this debate at this point. But women are not permitted to become priests or really hold any powerful roles in the Catholic
Apart from
Church.
being a saint, you have to die. You have to be a
Yeah.
especially holy person,
Um,
die, and have some miracles happen. That's pretty much it, really. Like
you
truly.
can be a nun, but nuns don't have power the way
Right.
a priest would have power. So there are a lot of women in Catholicism who are looking for that strong female presence, and many people will obviously go to Mary, Jesus's mother.
Yep.
But here's another strong woman now, folk saint,
Hmm.
but another
Hmm.
strong woman, and I think that's part of the reason you see strong devotion among women
Yeah.
in
Yeah.
this case.
Definitely. Yeah. And so all of that's to say that there really isn't a clear origin narrative for La Santa Muerte, which is really unique in the world of spirit beings if we want to look at them broadly, cross-culturally. And it's definitely out of the ordinary for Catholic saints because the story, the narrative of who they were in their life is like the most important part.
Well, and the majority of Catholic saints were living
Right,
people,
exactly. Yeah, yeah,
all of them.
exactly.
I mean,
Yeah,
angels aside. So,
right. To see a new religious movement that is the fastest growing in the world not have a clear origin is I find that really surprising.
mm,
Because if you think about even some of the other folk saints in Central America, there may be a somewhat hazy or even dubious origin story, but there is one. And with Santa Muerte, there really isn't. And like I said, people don't care, which I think is kind of cool in the sense that they're like, look, she does the work for me, and that's all that I care about.
yeah, so who is she actually? There's no real origin story, but who is this Saint Death, this skeleton saint? So she's portrayed as a female Grim Reaper.
Hmm.
So if you look at the imagery, and I mean, you can go to our Substack and see some of the imagery. We'll also link to some of it in our show notes. But she really is portrayed. She's a skeleton.
Hmm.
And sometimes she's wearing a wedding dress. That's a common one. But you
Hmm.
also see her in sort of a cloak, more like what you'd expect from a Grim Reaperess.
Yep.
Um, but she's always a skeleton, which is an
Hmm.
interesting portrayal. You don't see that with any other folk saints that I can think of. Um, the
Yeah.
portrayal specifically
Yeah.
like that. So you will often see her in this sort of shroud or tunic, like that stereotypic Grim Reaper. But you also see many different colors.
Yeah, the colors are so important with Santa Muerte.
Yeah, so tell us a little bit about
Yeah.
some of those colors.
So we're gonna beat you over the head with colors because we're gonna talk about them here. We're gonna talk about them in a little bit. But basically, I think it's important to highlight there's three sort of quote unquote traditional colors with Santa Muerte, and those are white, black, and red. White being the most popular, typically is seen as symbolizing purity, protection, gratitude. Black is considered somewhat the least popular in public because of its associations with witchcraft, the idea of neutralizing enemies, and also some very specific cases of protection. And then red is associated with this idea of passion, lust, and love. Now, this, during her period of being underground, so before the early 2000s, this is what was most clearly associated with her. So she was kind of portrayed and understood as someone that you could petition for issues of love and relationships, not so much of these other associations that we're going to talk about.
And so it really started out with that very sort of feminine
Yes, yes,
perspective,
exactly.
but
And
less of that now. I mean,
yeah, yeah,
it's not pure feminine anymore.
yeah, it's interesting, and I think that's something we should talk to Dr. Chestnut
Yeah.
about because I do find that there was a clear gendered
Yes.
dynamic with
And I
Santa
don't see it as
Muerte.
much
And it
anymore.
seems like maybe that's not the whole picture anymore, and so
Right.
that's an interesting change. So after our traditional colors, we're not done. So we have gold, which is considered the second most popular. And when we talk about popularity, this is about how often you're seeing statues, candles, because every statue comes in one of these colors, every candle comes in one of these colors. And so when we're talking about popularity, it's about visibility at shrines and things like that. And gold is used to be associated with money, prosperity, abundance. Purple, not often seen at stores, which is somewhat interesting, or altars, is associated specifically with supernatural healing. So even though it's not as popular, it's oftentimes not even seen as being available.
I'd also really like to talk to Dr. Chestnut about that one.
Yeah, I want that piece. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, because I think, well, one, for our purposes, that's like really interesting for us because we're interested in this intersection of spirituality and healing and the paranormal and things like that. But there seems to be like a really clear demarcation between healing and supernatural healing with
Well,
Santa
yeah, and
Muerte that
this, I mean, supernatural healing has a very specific sort of thing that it
very distinct
is.
connotations.
Right. And if you think about her as supplanting Saint Michael and Mary,
Right.
I mean, these are the two individuals other than Jesus that Catholics call to during
Hmm.
exorcism.
Hmm.
And of course, purple is also the color of an exorcist, the
The
stole that he
soul.
wears. So
Hmm.
I find all of that very interesting, and it might just be, sort of borrowed from one religion, or
Sure.
but I find it to be an interesting piece to this, and I'd love to know more about how Santa Muerte fits into exorcism
Yeah,
and things
yeah,
like that.
definitely. So after purple, we have green. This is one of her more popular or more well-known, I think, associations in terms of like specificity, right? Because if we want to talk about like protection and things like that, you can use most saints for that, right? But green for her is justice and legal problems. And I think it's important to note here that she's not seen as a judge. She's seen as a sort of devoted lawyer and advocate for her client, so to speak. She's not judging whether or not what you did or what you're asking is right or wrong. She's working for you. And that is one aspect of her devotion that people really are drawn to.
And that I think is one aspect that really clearly shows one of the reasons why she will not be embraced by the
The church
church.
wants to keep her as far away as possible. Yeah.
Right. I mean, because if you think about it, she's not serving as a judge. She is equally there for someone who is a criminal and someone who is a
Yeah.
law enforcement
Yeah.
official. You know, that's really important.
Yeah.
And there are differences in
Mhm.
Catholicism as to, how that would be handled.
Right. Right. There's a lot of guilt and judging going on in the Catholic Church.
There's a lot of guilt there, yes.
Yes. So next we have brown, which is associated with enlightenment, discernment, wisdom, and totally associated with those three things, finding lost objects.
Yeah, I know that's kind of a
Now, I
fun
do
thing.
love this though, because there is like this whole tradition of saints and finding lost objects. I know
There
Saint
is.
Anthony is
There
like
is, yes.
super important. There's like a
Yeah.
little prayer you can say when you've lost stuff, which is super cool. And I love that humans lose so much stuff that we're like, you know what, we got to work that into our religion somehow because I'm tired of looking for things. I absolutely love that.
I think that probably says we have too much stuff, right?
It might, but regardless, I think it's funny. And also like super practical. I think that's the piece of that that's really interesting to me is that's just so ridiculously practical.
Yes, yes.
Next we have blue. It's associated with concentration and insight. And then the last color is actually not really a color at all, but it's the seven color candle, which brings together all of these and is kind of based on the Siete Potencias candle, which is popular in Santeria. And so this idea is kind of you can use that candle to kind of help with things that kind of overlap between each of these things. And those multicolored candles, you'll see them all the time at botanicas and stuff. Those are some colors. So when we're talking about colors in terms of her depictions, we're talking about the color of her clothing. Now, after that, her sort of paraphernalia, if you want to call it that, are holding a scythe in her right hand. So again, we're right on that Grim Reaper imagery. The idea that it's used to harvest souls or also for help with money. So sometimes you'll see her holding the scythe, or the scythe is oftentimes removable on the statues, and you'll see devotees wrapping dollar bills around the scythe and then putting it back in her
That's
hands.
something I love about the statues.
Hmm.
You can take them apart and
Yeah,
change them,
it's
and
so cool. Yeah, and there's like
people will dress them
yeah,
differently
I was gonna
depending on
say
what they're asking
there's a
for. And
whole tradition of like customizing your
yeah,
statues, particularly with what she wears.
yeah. And so sometimes the scythe is even removed, and instead there's a set of scales. So like
Yeah,
for
yeah,
justice,
exactly. Yeah.
which I think that's really cool that, you can kind of mold this into what you need at that
Hmm.
time.
Hmm. So then in her left hand, she's often depicted holding a globe to show that she has complete dominion over the whole world because none of us escape death. Sometimes you'll see this depicted a little bit differently. She'll be standing on top of the globe. And then she also, somewhere in her association, includes an owl. Sometimes it's at her feet, sometimes it's perched on her shoulder. Now, interpretations of this are kind of mixed. So some folks associate this owl in the sort of Euro-American sense of wisdom.
This is the syncretism,
Yeah,
right?
exactly. Yeah, exactly. And then other folks on the flip side look at indigenous ideas in Central America about the sound of owls signaling impending death.
And that's not just in Central America. I mean,
No.
you see that throughout North America as well.
Yeah.
The idea of the owl being a harbinger
Hmm.
of death.
Hmm.
And so, seeing both of those things connected really shows that syncretism.
Hmm. Hmm. So, apart from her depictions, Chris, what do people what's she like?
Well, she is the personification of death,
Hmm.
which is why a lot of people are a little, let's say, weirded out
Yeah.
by her.
Hmm.
It's interesting because as many people who are as very, very devoted to her, there's almost more people who are kind of scared.
Yeah, people have
I,
like strong
yeah.
feelings about her for sure. She's definitely polarizing.
So she is the personification of death. She is not a spirit, and I think we said this before, she's not the spirit of a once living person, like many, many saints are. So she is death itself. She's the patron saint of the dispossessed and marginalized. And so many people think that this means criminals. And there
Hmm.
there is a large devotion to her among people who have been in prison, among the cartels.
Hmm.
So there is that. But those are not the only people who are dispossessed and marginalized. So she is also the patron saint of the poor, of the LGBTQ plus population, and of convicts and criminals. So it's people who are, in some sense, marginalized. She does have an association with this narco trafficking, and this is overblown.
Yeah.
The media really goes nuts with
Hmm.
this.
Hmm.
And it is true that she does have that association, but that doesn't mean that, that's all that she is. So Jesus Malverde is considered to be the patron of narcos, even though Santa Muerte devotion kind of
Hmm.
overlaps. So having her be very specific to narcos is not really accurate. Now she has all of these different color associations and is a multifaceted saint. And so she's petitioned by people from all walks of life. It's not just about criminals. And that's really important to understand because for a long time, that's how she was seen and that's how she was portrayed in this country, certainly. Oh, that's just for
Hmm.
criminals.
Hmm.
So it's important to make that distinction. She is also popular among the Mexican military.
Yep.
And as I mentioned before, government officials. And so she's up where she works on both sides
She's
there,
yeah, exactly. Yeah, she
which
like
is great.
plays all sides, which is kind of cool. Like good for her.
Yeah. She is very popular among women, and for some of the reasons we talked about earlier. She has become more of a patroness of small businesses, and not just women-run businesses, but
Yeah.
certainly including them. And she is a newly minted, is that what I say it? Patron of the Mexican penal system. And so again, not just inmates, but lawyers. And I love this duality
Yeah, it's cool.
that she's on sort of both sides. And again, that's that non-judgmental
Hmm.
part of her. She's amoral. She just grants petitions that she wants to grant.
Hmm.
And it's usually things that other saints won't consider. So, people will go to her with things that they don't feel like they can go to other saints for.
Hmm.
And so it's really things that are somewhat outside of mainstream Catholicism, because in Mexico, you're talking about a very Catholic country.
Hmm.
So it's things that people would not be comfortable petitioning Virgin of Guadalupe for, or going to their priest and talking to him
Hmm.
about, or
Right.
things like that. So I think she's filling a need
Hmm.
that's
Yeah,
just
and
not
I
being
think
filled.
it's cool that like a lot of devotees will talk about like they petitioned other saints unsuccessfully
Yeah,
and
yeah.
are like, all right, fine, we're gonna go to Santa Muerte and she will help me out, even though whatever other Catholic saint I asked
Yeah, someone
wasn't
else didn't help me.
right.
So that's cool. So, you go to all these others and then you go to her.
Mm.
And often she will grant those.
Yeah.
And so that brings her more devotees.
Yeah, that's the thing that really like runs underneath all of Santa Muerte devotion is like people really point to she gets stuff done. And that's
Right.
why people are so into Santa Muerte.
Yeah. And so if we look at that, if we look at people who are getting very, very into Santa Muerte, we mentioned before altars. So just to speak a little bit about altars, everybody's seen pictures of altars from Dia de los Muertos.
Mhm.
So, people have seen what that kind of looks like, what an altar is. But many, many altars are devoted to La Santa Muerte. And they start with, of course, the nice statue of her. And
Mhm.
they can be in the different colors, they can be multicolored. Some of them are huge.
Yeah, some of them are really
I
big.
mean,
Yeah, and there's a whole tradition of, bringing if you have a personal statue, bringing it to one of these big
and
popular
touching
public
it too,
shrines. Yeah.
which feels again very relic-y and
So
Catholic.
Catholic. So Catholic, man. Yeah, it's wild, but yeah, it's super cool. And so when you have these altars, in addition to having this big statue of the bony lady, you'll see that she's almost quintessentially Mexican because she sort of consumes the same things that her devotees enjoy. So you'll see lots of different drinks, including water, but oftentimes tequila, that's a really popular offering for her, but rum and beer as well. You'll see different kinds of things you can smoke, including tobacco, cigars, and cigarettes, as well as marijuana, but chocolates, candies, fruit, especially apples and oranges to symbolize abundance and prosperity. Bread, she likes that good Mexican sweet bread.
And
And
flowers.
flowers. Flowers are huge. So you almost always see flowers on Santa Muerte
And
altars.
specifically, marigolds.
Yeah,
So
so marigolds are really if you know anything about Dia de los Muertos, you know that marigolds are primo. They're all over everything with Dia de los Muertos, and there's actually some questionable or dubious associations with indigenous roots on those too.
right.
That's part of where that question with Day of the Dead comes from. And then, of course, you'll see all of the various candles. This is probably the most common devotional object. It's super cheap. They're accessible. If you can't afford a big fancy statue, you can probably afford a candle. But you'll also see things called ex votos. These are offerings that are related to vows or promises made to Santa Muerte. There's kind of tokens of gratitude, so to speak, that show devotees. It's a way of saying that, like, thanking Santa Muerte. So you'll see like photos of recipients of miracles, scraps of paper with little like words of thanksgiving, or also milagros, which are these metal charms in the forms of body parts. Are really popular across Catholic Central America and even into the American Southwest.
But this kind of stuff, I mean, these altars, you see altars in Catholicism. You
Hmm.
also see altars in Santeria,
Hmm.
in Voodoo,
Hmm.
and you see a lot of influence from there as
Yeah,
well.
so much influence. Yeah, yeah. The greater Caribbean and Central American world religiously is really interesting to look at because there's not only this interplay between European European Christianity, particularly Catholicism, and indigenous beliefs, but there's the interplay of African diasporic traditions. So these are traditions that were um, sort of formed in the diaspora by African slaves and their descendants, and all of this is playing together and influencing all of the religious belief in Central America and the Caribbean. And it's really interesting to look at them in comparison to each other because you see lots of similarities.
There's also specifically prayer
Mm-hmm.
to her, to La
Mm-hmm.
Santa Muerte.
Mm-hmm.
And these can be either sort of the formulaic rote prayers that are common in Catholicism, though Catholicism is not entirely kind of that. There's also a lot of
You guys
impromptu
get a
stuff
bad
there.
rap for that, yeah.
We do, but a lot of people just go to that because you remember it. You memorize these things and you don't know what else to say, so you jump into a Hail Mary.
Let's just throw down a rosary.
But, but they can also be those more impromptu, what many people consider to be the Protestant style impromptu prayers.
Yeah.
So you see a lot of these. You can see the formulaic prayers, so like the Hail Mary, the Our Father, they've been modified
Yeah.
to have sort of Santa Muerte versions.
Hmm.
And so you may hear something that sounds kind of like an Our Father,
Hmm.
but isn't.
Yeah,
So
exactly.
that sort of thing happens. And then you have people who are just doing sort of intercessory requests, which is done through prayer as well. There is even a Santa Muerte rosary
There is.
that was developed by Doña Queta. So So what does all of this prayer do? What do the altars do? What is it that Santa Muerte does for her followers?
Yeah, this is the most important piece, really. And I know I've kind of said this like 14 times at this point. Really, when it comes to Santa Muerte devotion, people are devoted to her because she delivers. She's understood as dependable. She fulfills devotees' petitions. She doesn't judge you for the things you're petitioning. She just gets the work done. A lot of the things that she does mirrors those lists of color correspondences that we ran through before. So we can start with this idea of sort of protection. It goes back to our story from the beginning. Here's how that story ended.
Doctors released Hernandez after 4 days, telling him he would have to return in a few months to repair the shattered bones in his arms. On the day before he was scheduled to have his arms x-rayed, the devout cop decided to stop by Templo Santa Muerte Internacional in Tultitlan, a high crime area on the gritty outskirts of Mexico City, and he asked the lavender-cloaked skeleton for yet another miracle, that of healing his broken bones. His request was granted the following day when the doctor reading his x-rays pronounced the bones healed with no need for surgery.
So I think that pretty well speaks for itself.
It does.
I don't know how much more we can belabor that point. But that is a really common,
And that would be
type of
classified as a
petition.
miracle.
Yeah, exactly. There's lots of discussion around Santa Muerte devotion in terms of protection as well as healing, and that's a really, really good example. Also, we can look at the idea of vengeance. So this is kind of where some of those morally dubious requests that can't be made to your sort of standard canonized Catholic
Yeah, you're
saints.
not going to St. Francis for vengeance.
I mean, vengeance against like animal abusers or something. St.
Yeah,
Francis
yeah, I
might be
can get
down with that,
St.
right?
Francis might be
Yeah,
down with that.
he'd be
Yeah.
down with that.
Yeah.
I feel like he'd be a lot nicer about it, but
Maybe
he
not.
just seems like a
So,
nice guy. I don't know. And this is kind of where some of that popularity with narco trafficking comes in too. I think one of the things that really triggers that association with narco trafficking is the Mexican authorities or the American authorities go in and they bust someone and they find an altar and Santa Muerte's on that altar. And for a lot of folks, that may be their first sort of exposure to Santa Muerte devotion. And I think then you add on the level of media hype
and
and
what she looks like.
sensationalism and what she looks like, right?
Yeah.
She's,
And
a
the
Grim Reaper.
reality is we could find, various religious objects in many criminals' homes or places of business or wherever.
Yeah.
And we don't automatically say, oh, this person, has a mezuzah or, we
Right,
don't
right.
we don't immediately
Hmm.
jump to that with
Yeah,
other religions.
yeah,
And so it's a bit of unfair treatment.
yeah, it is. And next, like we said, Santa Muerte is pretty clearly linked to matters of love. This aspect of her work is probably the oldest, based on academic accounts anyway. And people will petition her for all kinds of things to attract love, to keep a lover from straying, help getting out of toxic relationships, all of those things.
And this is another thing that people don't go to your standard saints for.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, this isn't something that seems sort of nefarious, but you're not petitioning,
Right.
the Virgin Mary for your help with your marriage necessarily, at least in that sense, right?
Right. Right.
Um, And then, as we said before, prosperity and abundance work is really popular with her. This idea of success with business and employment. This is where her popularity among small business owners is kind of growing. And then legal matters. This is a big one as well. This kind of overlaps a little bit with the use of black candles, but extends to providing justice for devotees. So, like I said before, she's more of a lawyer rather than a judge.
Yeah.
You're petitioning her, you're giving her offerings, so you're paying her in a sense, just like you would pay your lawyer. And she's doing the work.
Yeah. And finally, and the one that, is obviously interesting to me, which,
Hmm.
given my background in medicine and healing, having a good death
Yeah.
and healing itself.
Yep.
A lot of folks in Western cultures, as we've talked about before, are not great at this. Um, I think there are a lot of very special people who help with hospice and things like that,
Yep.
and they promote having a good death. And I think more of us need to jump on that bandwagon
Yeah. Props to
and
those people.
and promote that good death. But Santa Muerte, helps with that and helps to provide a good death.
Hmm.
She helps to alleviate that fear that many
Hmm.
people have about death. And it could be something that draws people to her. Catholicism has a saint for a good death, and that's Saint Joseph. But most people don't really talk about that.
Hmm.
And
Yeah.
so I think, that's something that draws people to her. She also in the healing realm helps with overcoming substance abuse,
Mhm.
which is a yellow candle. And substance abuse is definitely something that there's a lot of. So,
Yeah, and the
help with
irony
that
of
is great.
and the irony of that though is that like one of her most popular offerings is tequila and marijuana.
Right, right.
Which is like, you go girl, she playing both
But
sides.
that's not abuse.
True,
Having a
that's true.
shot is not
That's true. You're
abuse.
right. You're right. You're
So,
right. Absolutely, you're right.
but she's also someone who a lot of narcos do go to. So,
Right.
it's
It's she
got a lot of not just dualities. I don't even, there's more to it.
she's just doing the work, man. Yeah.
Yeah. Um, so she does have some specific healing rituals dedicated to her, and they do overlap a bit with Curanderismo.
Hmm.
And that's another thing we could talk about all day long, is kind of how those different rituals overlap and how they're done, but we won't go into that.
And if you don't know what
Um,
curanderismo is, that's a Mexican system of folk healing
yeah.
that's popular throughout. If you've heard of egg cleansings and limpias, then that's
Yeah.
that's
And
right.
and uses more than just the physical to heal, which
Yes,
again
it does.
is so common everywhere
Yeah,
except allopathic medicine.
that's right.
So yeah, anything else?
Well, I mean, one thing, we kind of touched on this before, her devotion during the pandemic was
Hmm.
kind of interesting, or there was kind of a change in devotion in the sense that, she became petitioned to protect devotees specifically from COVID,
Mm.
oftentimes when they weren't able to distance because of their work or whatever else. And like I said, there were special Santa Muerte candles for COVID protection, which is awesome. And Google them; they're super cool.
And
Um,
part of her role as helping with a good death
yeah,
probably
yeah,
entered into that.
That
Yeah.
fits right into everything that was going on in the pandemic. Yeah. That's kind of our intro to Santa Muerte. We want to leave
Part
you
one.
all, yeah, part one, exactly. We want to leave you all kind of with, and with the sense that religion oftentimes is seen as, I think a lot of people can think of it as overly structured, as very strict. And Catholic folk saints are such a good example of where it's very lived in, it's very gritty, it's very everyday folks doing things. And Santa Muerte devotion, not only being interesting because it's one of the fastest growing religious movements in the world, but it's also a great example of that and the way that people deal with all of the issues that are going on in their life and petition supernatural beings to help them with those, and how devotion in that way can grow. And so, like I said before, we are very excited to have Dr. Andrew Chestnut on the podcast for our next episode.
Very first
It'll,
interview.
yeah, it'll be our first interview.
Hopefully one of many.
Hopefully one of many. We're very excited to have him on. I will save all of my gushing for when we have that podcast. But after we get done with that, we'll be moving on to cross-cultural perspectives on exorcism. So if The Exorcist is your favorite movie, we have got you covered. We'll be talking a little bit about Catholic exorcism as well as exorcism in a couple of other contexts. Thanks for joining us on Beyond the Human, where the strange, the supernatural, and the deeply human collide. If today's journey into the unknown sparked your curiosity, we'd love for you to subscribe, leave a review, and share the show with fellow seekers of the extraordinary.
Have a story, question, or theory of your own? Reach out. We want to hear how the paranormal shapes your world, too. You can find us online at Patreon, Facebook, and Instagram.
Until next time, stay curious, stay critical, and keep thinking beyond the human.